So, the Northern Powerhouse. And thank you, I realise that not all of you are from the north, right, at this session. And that's kind of right and important for us, because this isn't just a project about the north of England, although the name is a bit of a misleader. What this is actually about is rebalancing the country for the whole of the economy's benefits. And actually that means that many of you who may not necessarily work here or have investments here already, we are really keen for you to come on in, right? We want you to come here and be part of this, because actually, without those of you who have been impressed and seen value in markets like that in London, right, which is not the enemy, they're allies, right? This is a global race to succeed. We need to innovate and lead in this country, and that means we need to collaborate with those in London and the South that we're not in opposition. So I'm going to start off by sort of running through what this thing actually is, right? Because I think sometimes businesses say to me, well, I understand that there's this place called the North of England, but what's the Northern Powerhouse and why is it something special? So we're particularly committed to thinking about future generations, right? So there is a productivity gap in this country, despite the fact that here in cities like Manchester, we've seen enormous economic growth and regeneration in the last 10 to 20 years. And that's been led by the place here in Manchester. But that growth and that excitement around Manchester City Centre in particular, and around Manchester as a kind of wider economy, has not been replicated across the whole of the north. And one of the reasons for that is our significant skills and educational gap. So the north of England, for those who are from outside, has some great schools actually. So again, don't let this be a sort of whinging northern presentation. But amongst the whole of our education system, particularly in those areas where we have had economic here in the previous 2 decades, we have seen far too many young people miss out on the opportunity of getting skilled employment. And that includes in sectors like retail and in the wider property and infrastructure plays, which obviously play such a big part in today's event. And we've got some solutions to that, right? So we brought out our reports at the beginning of this year called Educating the North, and Susan, who's been on the panel that we're about to have, is a great supporter of that, and in Bradford has led trying to transform their schools. And that's part of how Bradford's economy is now on the up, is because actually people who come there to invest can see the benefits of having a talented workforce that are starting to get more of the skills and opportunities that they would need to be able to contribute to some of the developments that happen in those places. And in particular, we're very much reaching out as well to those of you who may already be here in the north of England. So if you do have a business that employs a lot of people, if you're a developer that works with a lot of businesses that are planning to employ a lot of people, we would say that we have a message to you really, which is that we see that you have a responsibility to invest in high quality skills linked to your developments and those opportunities, because actually it's in your enlightened self-interest, right? Because we know one of the barriers to investment in some of the great places where there's some of the most I suppose, lucrative opportunities for uplift in terms of value, because we've got a lot of sites in the north, which if they were to be unlocked with investment would be worth a lot more, and are places where there's a lot of value to still be gained. Actually, one of the challenges is getting the type of skilled workforce you'd need to make the businesses that would locate there be successful. And so thinking about how we can unlock skills at the same time as we unlock property is a debate hopefully we can have a little bit more in the session. And another one of our panellists from Leeds City Council has got some great expertise there around inclusive growth. And obviously Leeds has got a fantastic property scene, but it's also got some phenomenal opportunities around how it's upskilling its own people, particularly, for instance, with businesses working with its universities to bring forward degree apprenticeships, which mean that we can get young people from some of the most disadvantaged areas in the north into high-skilled, high-quality jobs without just relying on some of the traditional national and international infrastructure around higher education, which doesn't necessarily serve the people who've grown up here in the north very well. So then we think about kind of creating and harnessing the future. And we start to touch on some of the themes from the last session. And obviously we talked a lot about logistics. And obviously in this audience, clearly as well as being partners, they are some of the great beneficiaries of some of the transformational change happening on our high streets through the growth of e-commerce. And I think what I would say about the next industrial revolution is if you look at some of the most exciting warehouses in the world, a lot of those are in the north of England. And in fact, we're going to see DB Symmetry, for instance, bringing forward a development in Darlington, which will be one of the most technically advanced warehouses in the world. and will offer the type of employment and the skill level of employment that people never associated with logistics in the past. And the AMRC, who are the people who have sort of revolutionised the factory in the north of England and in the world, and are respected from China and through back to the business parks and the businesses in Rotherham where they're set up, on the former site of the Orgreave coking plant. The AMRC are now working in logistics because they are bringing some of the cutting edge of robotics to that sector because it's an incredibly important space. And in the north of England, in terms of helping to reduce the costs in businesses that might be under challenge and pressure from the next industrial revolution and some of the huge changes affecting our world, we in the north have a particular position on that, which is we're not in the business of trying to stave off that change, right? Because that change is coming in all its different forms. And I'm sure in the discussion, we'll think a little bit about that in the case of the particular sectors that many people at this event work in. But the fundamental is rather than just accepting that loss of employment, particularly in the case of the north, actually, in many lower skilled sectors, what we're saying is actually that's a good thing, because what we need to do is then, in this opportunity, create the high skilled employment that sits alongside it. And obviously, being at a retail event, it would be wrong not to highlight the fact that in Greater Manchester, we have Boohoo, we have AO. We're probably at the cutting edge, actually, of e-commerce, not just in this country, but in the world. And how we learn and cut across sectors, and the way that John Lewis has demonstrated, right, between clicks and bricks, is vital if we're going to sustain employment in our high streets here in the north, whilst learning from some of those who are creating some of that transformational change and making it happen in the wider economy, who also happen to be based here. If we can cut across those learnings, then in the north, I think we can do a lot better in responding to the absolutely credible challenges to some of our traditional economic models and some of our traditional businesses, if we're going to make sure we can thrive in that environment rather than simply be recipients of change who are not able to do anything to respond. And here we'll also talk a little bit about the environment. So clearly a number of your businesses and the businesses that occupiers you're seeking to attract to developments you might be involved in, clearly energy cost is growing as a vital interest. It's already very important to many commercial occupiers in terms of the many factories we've got in the north and manufacturing facilities. Access to power and cost of electricity is a vital differentiator for many businesses looking to invest in the energy intensive space. But in reality, how we make our places more sustainable is a key agenda in the north. And obviously it contributes to thinking about how we reduce the costs of operating many of the businesses which also bring vibrancy to our cities and towns. So the next bit is about health. And you might think, well, what on earth's health got to do with the number of the businesses that you might be focused on? And I suppose the point about this vision, right, is it's not about individual sectors going off and doing particularly well. Because in the reality in the north, we've tried that, and that approach to economic growth doesn't really work. Because unless you tackle the fundamental challenges in an economy and the fundamental game-changing opportunities, what you tend to find is the very tactical interventions you make in individual sectors to make those sectors a success don't tend to work. And so around the health agenda, what I would say and what I would share with you as an audience this morning is there is a particular opportunity in health to help to improve the quality of lives people lead and their ability to work in jobs and provide the type of resource and capacity in the labour market that we need. There are far too many people in the north of England who are not well enough to work and lead much shorter lives that are full of years of ill health when they shouldn't. And we're doing a lot of work with the Northern Health Sciences Alliance about how we can change that here in the north of England. And actually, when we think about what our towns are for and how people use our cities, actually being able to create footfall through people walking, for instance, rather than imagining that just cities are places we have to get people through as quickly as possible between their employment and their home, I think gives you an insight into what we're talking about, which is we're not talking about spending more money on healthcare, because that's not the solution. The solution is helping to make the people of the north healthier. And the problem is in the north of England, and Pat, who was on the last panel from Newcastle, works in a city with the most successful and highest performing healthcare system in the country, but with some of the worst health outcomes for patients. And so what that proves is it's not just about spending more money in the health system, it's about changing the way our economy and our society works to deal with some of these fundamental challenges, and at the same time create the types of opportunities which change the way our places work, which makes them better places for businesses to invest. So the types of livable environments that are easier for people to get around and are going to transform the way people travel and give people mobility that responds to their needs and better serves their long-term health outcomes. So, for instance, proving to people it's better for them and cheaper to walk a short journey rather than get in a car, that will be transformative, we believe, to many sectors of the economy, because it will allow people to take advantage of opportunities on their doorstep, which currently they never perceive or even know are there because they never walk past them. And so I think a debate about footfall and about how footfall isn't just about businesses but also about health is certainly a debate that we as an organisation are always keen to have with people around the north and beyond. And so I'm then on to place. And this is probably the area that most strikes a chord with those of you here today, I would hope, and isn't probably the place I need to do a lot of talking, because I think as a group of people who work in the sectors represented at this event, I'd be really shocked if you aren't as interested in place as we are. And we think place is really important because I think it helps to motivate people, it helps to give people a sense of purpose and a sense of commitment. And I think if we look at some of the great developments that have come forward that have transformed retail in the north of England, they have been driven by people with a commitment to places and a real buy-in to making them work. And here in Manchester, I don't think this city is defined by its retail offer, but I think that its retail offer has responded to a place that has a really certain sense of itself and has been absolutely committed to transforming its economic future, and has very effectively, I would argue, used its retail offer to help contribute to that. And obviously that's having to be reinvented because of some of the challenges on what's happening in our cities and towns in terms of how they're being used. But I think that contributing positively to that debate and understanding actually that our places are partly about people spending money in them, but also about their social and community value, I think will also help to keep people visiting places like Manchester in the types of numbers they currently do, regardless of some of those bigger trends that are happening in the economy. Because actually, cities, particularly as places people want to spend time and enjoy, and their long-term trajectory in terms of what they've been used for, the way we use them now and the exact split between those uses is not fixed, actually. So if you go back 40, 50 years, what we did in our cities was very different, but they still, in terms of particularly our urban centres, had a real value. And I think as an organisation, we would argue, because we're interested in place, because we think it matters, that we need to get back and discover why people have always wanted to come together in places together, and then understand how we retrofit some of our environments to make those sorts of interactions ones people want to have again, to make sure that people don't fall out of love with our places and retreat to a much more private view of the world and a more private style of life that takes them out of cities like Manchester, out of our towns, because we don't think that's necessarily good for our society, but we know it's certainly not good for our economies or for the types of places we want to create. And finally, connectivity in the wider sense. So a lot of people will associate the Northern Powerhouse with trains, almost exclusively with trains, because we do talk about that an awful lot. And the fact that it's potluck really whether I make this event this morning and have to leave extra early because I'm absolutely certain that my train will be late rather than believing it will be on time and being surprised when it isn't. That's a fundamental barrier, right, to economic growth. But I think as an audience that doesn't just have people from the north in it, I'm also going to recognise that connectivity in some other parts of the UK also sometimes isn't quite what it should be. There's a particular point about it in the north of England, though, which is about creating the growth in our centres that we need and connectivity between our centres and our employment sites. So a business here in Manchester today will be employing people in the intervening years till we get to 2050, when we believe we'll have closed the productivity gap with London, from far beyond Greater Manchester. And businesses today in Manchester, whether they be some of our great brands like Selfridges or Harvey Nichols, or be smaller businesses and SMEs outside of the sectors that we're particularly talking about today, will rely on people from outside of Greater Manchester. So Northern Powerhouse Rail, which is a particularly important project for the north of England, is about bringing our cities closer together to allow for us to have all the benefits of London without some of the challenges that come from having one city with all that economic activity in it, but actually meaning that people can live in Bradford and work in Manchester, or live in Liverpool and work in Leeds, live in Hull and work in Manchester, which now would be a completely undoable journey, right? And there's a great standout in the exhibition showing all the fantastic things that Hull has got to offer. But I imagine many people who live in the north of England, never mind from outside of the north, will necessarily have ever been there and experienced it, because apart from the city of culture, which has hopefully changed people's expectations and understanding of that place, people were so unlikely to go there because it's so difficult to get to. And we are going to transform that and change that for the future. And that's baked in, right? So the government is already investing almost £3 billion in improving the rail connectivity between Leeds, for instance, and Manchester, and that will benefit people from Liverpool to Newcastle, because you can't get from Liverpool to Newcastle without crossing the Pennines. And so that level of connectivity between some of our great places and larger communities that can start to use them, the 15 million people who live in the north, is a real game changer for the north of England. So that sort of brought me to the end of what I was hoping to say. I'm sort of on time, I think, Steph, so I won't get shouted at. So it's really nice to have had the time to talk to you. I know in the discussion I think we'll get into much more specifics about some of the challenges in the north for growing the industries here today. But I hope that very short introduction gives you a bit of context. And again, if you are not from the north, very much welcome today, and hope you enjoy your visit to Manchester. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I mean, fascinating to hear all of those different elements to it as well. I remember when I first heard about the Northern Powerhouse, I remember pointing out to George Osborne at the time that it was also the name of a nightclub in Newcastle. So that was quite a moment, and he offered to be pictured outside of it and things. But anyway, anyone who knows Newcastle will know it well. So let me bring up our panellists for this session along with Henri. We've got Angela Barnicle, who's Chief Officer at Asset Management and Regeneration of Leeds City Council, Councillor Susan Hinchcliffe, who's leader of Bradford Council, and Tim Vaughan, who's Chief Executive of the, well, I would say Moorgarth, but it's probably more likely to be Moorgarth Group. So please welcome them to the stage. Tim's just on his way up now. So let me kick off then, Angela, with you in terms of what your city's role has been in the Northern Powerhouse, would you say?
Okay, so Leeds is at the geographic heart of the Northern Powerhouse, and Leeds City Region contributes about £66 billion to the Northern economy and, well, the UK PLC every year. So we're a fundamental part of that jigsaw. But not only that, I think certainly across the Northern Powerhouse, it's right that Leeds City Region, along with Manchester, along with Liverpool, along with Newcastle and Hull, all provide choice to investors. So we need to be competitively complementary. And I think that's the really great thing about our cities, that we all have a slightly unique offer, which means that as a collective, we can tell our story really powerfully across a pan-northern network.
Because that was one of the genuine concerns, really, wasn't it? Was this idea that all of the cities within the Northern Powerhouse might start to compete against each other. And Susan, I know you've done a lot in your area. What has it meant for you? What's the Northern Powerhouse done, would you say, for your work?
I think there's increasing collaboration, actually, between leaders across the north. We understand absolutely that for Bradford to be successful, I need Leeds to be successful. And actually, for the West Yorkshire Combined Authority area, which I chair, to be successful, we need Manchester to be successful as well for the whole of the north to get the investment it needs. So there's a few things that have happened, like Transport for the North, which is all the local authority leaders coming across the north together to decide on what the investment priorities are. That's a 30-year plan to bring £100 billion GVA, additional GVA to the area. And I think just the other week we had Convention of the North, where we were at as well, which is all leaders coming together to say, you know, it's not about competing with London, it's not about saying, oh, being chippy about the south, it's about saying, if we have the right investment, we can return this to the UK PLC economy. So we're much more confident now, I think, as the north, and that working together is starting to bear fruit.
Right. How long do you think it will be before then we can say, and I'm going to put this to both Angela and Susan, that we have actually achieved what was set out with the Northern Powerhouse dream, I guess? What would you say, Angela?
I mean, hopefully as a very ambitious city region and northern, I hope we never reach our goal, because our goal should continuously change. And the one thing that I've realised recently is certainly in local government, because we're always focused on the medium and long term, sometimes we forget to tell people that we've actually reached the goal that we originally set out to achieve. So for instance, we were doing an event on HS2 in Leeds last week, where the business community was saying, that's brilliant, but what are you doing this year in the station? And we were like, oh, right, well, there's an extra platform. We've already done this, this and this. And sometimes I think because of resource constraints and because of that ambition, we perhaps don't tell the story of the month to month, year to year, and we're probably over the last quarter have told probably the 5, 10, 15-year programme.
Yeah, Susan, would you agree on that then? Are we hiding our light under a bushel with this?
Yeah, I mean, in Bradford, we've got an economic strategy which gives us targets up until 2030. So we've got a long-term plan about how we're going to increase and add another 4 billion to our GVA. But you're right, absolutely. If West Yorkshire Combined Authority, we've already got £1 billion growth deal that we're spending. We've opened 3 new stations in the last 2 years. One of those, Appley Bridge in my district, actually reached its 5-year passenger target within 12 weeks of opening. There's a lot of latent growth potential there, and we're working hard with the growth deal that we've got to deliver those short-term ambitions. But we do need that big investment from government to invest in those heavy rail, which actually give us the northern connectivity, that agglomeration effect across the north, which will really start to accelerate our growth.
Yeah, I'll come back to some of those points, but Tim, let me bring you in at this point, because your group's worked closely, haven't you, with Bolton City Council. Tell us about what you've done with them and how you did it, I guess.
Well, it was back in 2013. We were looking at a shopping centre investment project. What we do is try and reposition shopping centres as they were called. Significant improvement in leisure. Needed a place which was basically had a gap. Bolton were a very keen local authority to grow their local economy. They had very ambitious plans for the town centre. They'd already delivered on the university. They were delivering on the new interchange. So there was already a really good story of improvement in the local infrastructure. So we jumped on the back of that on the basis that there was no leisure economy internally. There was sort of a burgeoning university that was just not being serviced. So we basically bought a beautiful old 1853 market hall with a not so beautiful Grosvenor scheme on the back of it, and converted it and repositioned it by putting leisure in, so cinemas, food. But what we've done is work very hard at community. So we have done a huge amount of work in building relationships with the local community to drive our footfall.
In what way? How did you build those relationships?
Personal contact, but working in partnership with the local authority, with local groups, music groups, theatre groups, charities. So literally getting into every aspect of the local area. I mean, there's 286,000 people in a really eclectic mix of population there. So lots of things to go for, but it's absolutely integral to our offer is to make sure that people feel like we are the meeting place in Bolton as an example. And fortunately, it started to gain some momentum, and Bolton Council have just got another 250 million investment going into the town. So
that's excellent,
it's worked well.
And just to ask you a bit more about that community group things, because I think that's really interesting, because sometimes you can feel like something appears where you live and you never really knew much about it and you might love it or hate it. But working with community groups, what does that actually mean in practical terms? Did you send people around to talk to them? Did you bring them in to do things?
It's just getting engagement. So we put a stage in the middle. It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
We put a stage in the middle of the shopping centre. People come and perform. So we have singing groups. We have dance groups. We have all sorts of eclectic mix of people coming in and using the facility as a community facility, so it becomes part of the environment. And that's what we're doing on our other centres as well, is building that relationship. But it's the only way we see that you can continue the regeneration of the town centres, because obviously, as we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of threats from outside, and people very much are honing down on their community facilities now and wanting something different.
And Henri, do we see then, do you think, enough of this happening, this engagement with communities to make these projects happen? Because then you get buy-in, don't you, in a lot of sense, and in a monetary sense as well.
I think it's really interesting. I think I've also heard about this scheme because I think you've got some artists in there as well, haven't you? And it's, I haven't ever visited, but I've heard about this development because people are excited about it, and it's unusual. And I think it reflects something very similar to what happened in Bradford with the new shopping development that opened there that was long hoped for. I'm sure Susan can speak to it, which is that, and in that place, that's helped to get the business community together, set up a business improvement district. That's been one of the conduits for getting people to really think positively about their place. So I think what you need to do is unlock that confidence in our towns. I think as a Northern Powerhouse, and the Minister, Jake Berry, is very clear that as we look at this strategy, I think there was a misunderstanding that this was all about cities. And actually the point is you need cities to be successful because they're very big engines of economic growth. But actually the resources and people of Greater Manchester, when I talk about city, I mean the whole of the economic region of Greater Manchester, or the whole of Leeds City region, or Newcastle and its neighbours in Northumberland and North Tyneside, because that's where people come from and travel in and out of those places. And you've got to think about the relationships between where people spend their leisure time, where people work, and where they shop, where they do their retail offer. And I think that the reality is all of those connections are important to quality of life, actually. So we talk about our great countryside and our rolling hills, but actually we've got a lot of very nice, very important urban environments, a lot of them with a lot of historical architecture, right? It isn't limited to a Manchester, it stretches right across the north. And how you make use of those assets, whether it's old mills or whatever it is you've got to maximise those things, because what we can't do is have things sitting empty, because bluntly, one of the reasons why we don't get the levels of footfall and some of our towns are not succeeding is because we haven't been creative enough about what they're being used for. And that's not to say everyone, right, can have a digital hub in every little town centre full of digital businesses. It doesn't work like that. But what they can do is find an offer that will work. And I'm always struck by Red Brick Mill, which is in West Yorkshire, which is essentially in not the easiest place to make a development work, but it's probably one of the most popular kind of retail leisure destinations in the whole of Yorkshire. And you would never have realised what was possible there until someone did it.
Yeah.
The same is true of Salts Mill in Bradford. So I think experimenting, particularly with heritage assets, being a bit more creative about thinking that people want to spend time in places that are in city centres, but also in other places, and those aren't necessarily competing with each other, right? So what people want to do on a Sunday afternoon and go along and mooch somewhere to look at a sofa isn't the same about where they're going to go for their evenings out, for
Yes,
instance.
people
And we
want
need to
choice.
understand that balance, that the North has got a lot of different, very complementary offers,
Yeah.
and we need to find a way to help them all succeed. Otherwise, communities are going to feel left out because they're not getting a share of the opportunities that are available.
Yeah, and on Susan, let me bring you in on this. Given Bradford's been mentioned a few times, it's an award-winning city scheme. Absolutely. Winning an Revo award back in 2016. So, what about how you think the scheme's performing now? Do you think you're still you're reaping the benefits from it? Is it, and how? Well, how do you make sure that continues?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we're in an advantageous place because we had that £33 million and we were able to give business rates relief for new businesses coming to the city centre. Up to 92 vacant units, occupied those again, 700 jobs. So that certainly worked. But of course, we have to move on, and we're now on to the next thing. And actually, something the Bolton example I think showed quite clearly is that an investment in culture and leisure actually is really important, and to bring that life back to the city centre. So, NEC are now coming to Bradford, first investment outside Birmingham, and opening up a 4,000 live music venue in the city centre. And we're supporting them with a prudential borrowing with that, a forward borrowing against rent and rates. And that kind of investment is what we need to bring footfall and to bring a new sense of purpose, I think, as you say, to that cultural offering in the city centre, bringing people together. City Park as well is another example. We invested £23 million in new public realm, massive paddling pool basically for everybody in Bradford, and actually it brings all sections of the community together, so they feel that they're part of that place, they own it, they belong there, and that does make more people come in.
Yeah.
The North is very culturally diverse.
Oh, let me just throw a microphone down your way. I don't think we can quite hear you. Go on. The North is very culturally diverse, I heard.
Far more than I think people believe or realise.
Yeah.
You've got a huge breadth of culture across the north of England, all different aspects, but all contributing to the community, and that's something that we're working really hard with, continuing to do so with Bolton, but also in the other schemes that we've got across the UK. And there are many reports. Bilbao as an example, Detroit as an example. They've driven regeneration through culture, and I think the north of England is absolutely doing that. I mean, Manchester and Leeds are incredibly diverse.
I definitely don't need to be convinced about how brilliant the North is, but what does bother me and lots of people is the difficulty of getting around it. I'd love to be able to go to the new events place in Bradford. I'd love to be able to go to Bolton, but it takes ages, doesn't it? And so what do you think? I mean, Angela, what are your thoughts on this? It's all very well creating the brilliant things for locals, but how, if you want to get people from all over coming in and we all spread the wealth, we need a better transport system as well, and it just feels things like that are just so many years off. So how do you get around it?
So I think there are various levels to that, aren't there? I mean, it is undisputed that good growth needs good connectivity, and it was your point earlier, Henry, about saying if you thought your train was going to arrive on time, then it gives you a better sense of being able to do business. And I think one of the things that HS2 will do is give us that predictability, so that if your train is leaving Birmingham, in 58 minutes you are going to be in Leeds because you have that new track. But it's not just about intercity connection, it's about that intra-towns and intra-region, and it's about really a long-term modal shift. So I think why we've perhaps in the north been fixated, or perhaps you might hear we're fixated on the rail system, the heavy rail system, is because in terms of the hierarchy of mass transit, that is top of the food chain instead of getting the volume of people to where they need to be. But there are multiple layers that sit within that. In terms of, in Leeds at the minute, we are developing 5 bus priority corridors linked against economic growth corridors, and we sometimes get some criticism about investing in the buses, but actually what that does is it enables us to connect the most deprived parts of our communities very quickly on existing infrastructure. And when we do that, we can create these corridors that when all of a sudden that capacity gets too much for the bus, we can convert that into a light mass transit system. So that's perhaps why you hear a lot about the trains, is because it is that top of that food chain in terms of getting that connectivity.
Susan, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I just mentioned the Transport for the North plan, and that HS2 through Leeds is really important for us. Northern Powerhouse rail going east-west, that's the kind of connectivity we need. We know that Bradford being on Northern Powerhouse rail would immediately add 1.3 billion to our economy.
How do you know that?
We've measured it, we've done the studies.
But what have you measured?
So in terms of job growth, land value, we know that we've got an area to the south of the city centre, as Leeds has, where we know that actually there's land there to be developed and the values can increase massively actually once you get that rail connection in. And Leeds and Bradford combined, we're the biggest economy outside London, we're bigger than Birmingham. So the transport connectivity between the two cities needs to be improved quickly to be able to actually get the benefits of that agglomeration.
Tim, as an investment company, you know, you're developing these wonderful projects, how do you decide where to do it and who to work with?
Track record is often a good thing. I think stakeholder engagement is a really key thing. So we're doing a project at the moment up in Edinburgh and similarly another one in Reading. And we're following the same theme as we did in Greater Manchester with Bolton, which is getting involved immediately with the city councils, with Network Rail in some instances, and understanding what their requirements are, understanding what they're wanting to do and what they're wanting to achieve, and see how we can fit in. And if you actually believe the story and see the investment going on from a city like Leeds or Bradford or Manchester, you feel engaged and you feel like you want to invest in the economy and really maybe fill in one of the gaps.
And, in terms of the partnerships, with local authorities and things, some private investors might think, oh, that's where I'm concerned about what that's going to be like. What do you think the realities are? Do you find that there is engagement straight away?
I think each local authority is different. I think some local authorities are without doubt more open to engagement with people like us. I think there's an element of trust that private sector, not trustworthy, which is why we've gone down the route of being very open on everything that we've looked to do within the centres. So, no, I think there are certain local authorities that have much more of an open planning system, for example. So for people like us, we know that we've got that certainty we're going to be able to deliver the scheme we're proposing. That helps enormously from a banking perspective, from an occupational perspective as well. So it's it is getting that confidence that you've got a local authority that you're going to be able to work with, and they're going to back you. Obviously, you're not going to agree on everything, but they're going to back you and support your projects.
Yeah, and Henry, we talked about Bolton, Bradford, Leeds. Obviously, all we're seeing success stories there. What can other regions learn, do you think, from it?
So I think particularly around that kind of sense of getting people back into our places and making them feel vibrant again. I think there are still some examples about where people.
Do you want to grab that mic? I think it's
about where people haven't got an economic story yet. So we've got this kind of pan-northern story, and that's great, and a lot of people have kind of felt energised by that in the north of England. I think that I'd be the first to admit, though, that not every community has had that kind of awakening, and it's not all going to be the same, right? So if you're in Burnley, you're excited about your manufacturing, kind of the fact people keep ringing up from Japan saying I want a factory and they can't find them fast enough, right? So not everyone's going to go exactly the route that we've talked about today, but for those places where this is the right approach, where actually they've got the right assets to use and this is the right way for them to go, I think it's an incredibly powerful journey for places to go on. And I think that I think the advice round the north is what we've seen is places much more willing to work together. So I think on the I think arts and culture's come out as a really strong theme, and I'm glad it has, because I think Leeds obviously bid for capital of culture, didn't get it because the competition was stopped because we're leaving the European Union, but the momentum hasn't left, right? I think very similarly, Tees Valley is going to be bidding to be UK capital of culture. It's already announced it's going to do that. And I think that places like that you would never imagine would think of themselves that way until Middlesbrough opened in the millennium their own museum in terms of what they could offer in that space. No one would ever have thought of Middlesbrough and culture or modern art. And I think that change...
I would disagree.
Well, I think outside of the Teesside area, and I think that's changed people's confidence.
As an artist, I would say there's plenty of culture in Middlesbrough, love. Anyway.
Well, and I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah.
I think the point is that telling that story and thinking that culture's as important to the Teesside economy as the SSI Steelworks site, because those two things are equally important, and not just important to people who might care about it, and I care about it, but important to people who care about economic development, I think is the way forward.
Yes.
And I think certainly that story has definitely been one people have learned from each other about. But I think if you go to a Whitehaven or a Grimsby or an Immingham, I think some of this seems pretty remote. And I think in those places, to be honest, one of the challenges is that the local economy, the schools, for instance, are such a barrier to people wanting to move there. People don't really care what the town centre's like. That's not the thing that's putting people off. It's the other factors that put you off moving somewhere. And until you can get those other economic uses and those other things that people want to do in those communities, then actually there's not going to be the confidence to invest in those places.
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, I think we're in danger a little bit here of getting into the little microeconomies of what we got in the north of England. I mean, it's Northern Powerhouse is what it is. We have two enormous cities with huge advantages, with massive global businesses that are in those cities. And having been to MIPIM last year, the stand that Manchester had was absolutely superb, and it made it out as a real, true global city. And that's what I think we need to be doing for the Northern Powerhouse. Ideally is at an event like MIPIM, which is the international conference, is to actually have representation as a Northern Powerhouse. This is what we are. We have a massive international airport at Manchester. We're improving links into Manchester from the eastern side. Leeds is an enormous city with fantastic service industries. Having lived there since, well, for the last 20 years, my kids went to school in Bradford.
Yeah.
You know, I'm very keen on making sure that is a message that must get across. Because I think the danger is we can be seen in the north as little people that are sort of irrelevant and we all work in factories, and that is the perception.
Isn't there a danger then, though, on the flip side of that, is we become a homogenous lump to everyone else, that we're this northern, because I totally appreciate it's done so much for the area. I am one of the BBC staff who's moved from London to Salford. I've seen the incredible development there. Obviously, we've got the Channel 4 headquarters being decided, things like that. But also, you know, I'm not trying to bang on about Middlesbrough. It's a good one for me because obviously I know it, but there's lots of Middlesbroughs all around the country. The what's happening in Manchester and even Newcastle means absolutely nothing to Middlesbrough, the people who live there.
Yeah.
So that's why, you know, I think we talk about big cities when we talk about success stories, but the challenges are also...
But I think places like Middlesbrough will benefit from the strength of Newcastle, the strength of Leeds and the strength of Manchester. So our funders are South Africans. So where are you based? When I talk to the guys down there, we're based in Leeds. We've got offices in London. Where's Leeds? Oh, it's near Manchester. Oh, I know where that is.
Yeah.
That's the problem that you've got.
When they moved the BBC up to Manchester, my bosses were all saying to me, "You're going home, Steph?"
Yeah.
And I was like, you know, other side of the country, but yeah. So, but anyway, let's move it on. So it's great to hear the success stories and what other regions can learn, but looking at the challenges. So what would you say have been the challenges, and looking ahead, what are the hurdles you need to overcome?
So I think making the case for investment with the government is always a challenge. We obviously the B words come up a lot already this morning, but that does mean that there is some reluctance, I think, by government to invest in all transport projects. And speaking to last night to colleagues from down south, they were saying they had similar challenges. But I think this is probably the best time ever for the government to really reevaluate its approach to infrastructure investment. I think what we've seen over the last 100 years is that we've not invested as an economy in the key bits that make us function. So infrastructure, manufacturing, investment in R&D, innovation. You know, we've relied a lot on our past history and on our alliances, and now we're going to have to invest in our country to make sure we can actually accelerate and succeed as a country outside the European Union. And I think, so if you like, there's a challenge there because it's the bandwidth of government to be able to do this stuff, but there's also an opportunity to say, you know what, if you're starting to recalibrate your relationship with the rest of the world, you need to invest in your core product, and your core product is UK PLC.
Yeah. Angela?
I think skills is another one in terms of that challenge and local ownership of the skills agenda and the curriculum. And certainly at the minute we still don't have that local ownership. And whilst I don't really want to bang about culture anymore, you know, culture for Leeds has been transformational. And our bid to become the European Capital of Culture 2023 actually has brought a more cohesive community, a set of communities together, and it was wholly backed by the Leeds City region, because we know the power of culture in celebrating those skills that, you know, that culture and creative industries bring. And it's been really interesting, Henri referred to it earlier, that working with people like PwC, who created an apprenticeship, a degree apprenticeship programme with the University of Leeds, which is based around tech and creative skills, into traditionally what is a Big Four consultancy practice, because they realise that it's not just about the traditional, you know, entrant qualifications of, you know, maths and engineering and accountancy. Actually, it's about the arts based as well, and we really need those sectors to come together and to celebrate those breadth of skills.
Yeah. Let's open this out to the floor at this point and see if there's anyone who wants to ask a question from the audience. I can't see you as yet. Oh, there we are. Is there anybody who'd like to ask a question at this point? Don't worry if you don't, too shy or anything. Were you putting your hand up? No, you're waving at your friend. Bad timing. Okay, Henri, let me come back to you then. Just on, I guess, you know, following on from the challenges, we've heard some of them. So how do you then overcome them? How do we carry on the growth that we're seeing, you know, spreading this success as much as we can?
So I think it absolutely comes back to the debate we've had about understanding what your investable propositions actually are, and being really clear about what they are and why people should want to invest in them. So we've been really clear that the private sector can do a lot of this for itself and for the North if we can create the right environment. And it isn't. So I think partnering what I think Susan said, particularly about government investment, we will unlock government investment if we can demonstrate there is going to be private sector investment as well. And I'm struck by the fact that Manchester Airport, that was rightly mentioned earlier, investing £1 billion in their new terminal. Leeds, Bradford have invested some money last week, and Susan and I were there thinking about what that would mean for the local economy and for businesses that want to trade around the world, but also for investors who want to get there, right? Because it's easier and more and available to European markets because of that. And I think that the reality is those investments are all privately funded. And I think the same way that you look around what has happened to Manchester and the Manchester project and the role that Sir Howard and the city's leaders, including Sir Richard Leese, had in making that happen, what the model was to unlock opportunity. It wasn't to tell people exactly what they should do or where they should spend their money. And I think if the North can develop that really clear relationship, and I think MIPIM is a great platform. There are others, I think, around the year that I know that the combined authorities and the cities are working hard at to make this case and demonstrating this is somewhere that's open for investment, that there are these huge opportunities here. And also, let's be completely honest, a property market that isn't overheated like London. So Jim O'Neill, who's on our boards, who's our vice chair, who was in government with George Osborne on this agenda, and previous to that worked in financial services all through his career, he's really clear when he looks at the property market in London, not a lot of growth there, right, the last few years. You look at where you've seen genuinely good returns in investment in property, it's been the north of England. So the people who came up here when Howard and others in Leeds and other cities were first making this case have done very well, thank you very much, actually. There has been significant returns to be had up here. And I think particularly as we see more businesses and the number of global brands that come to us and say, we've heard about this Northern Powerhouse thing, and they've not heard about an individual city yet. They've heard this concept of somewhere they can get all this talent and all this great stuff's happening, and it's a bit like a Chinese megacity, but it's in Europe. They think, oh, that's quite interesting, actually. I've not heard of something like that before. And so I think we're really clear that government has got to unlock some of those big things, and in reality, no one else is going to build a new train line across the Pennines other than the government. And the private sector will play a role in that, but if government isn't fully behind it, that will never happen.
Yeah.
But actually, I think learning from what cities like Manchester and Leeds have done, applying it in other contexts actually, where we've got to make other big changes happen, like embracing AI, like embracing VR, for instance, which are going to have a massive effect on much of our economy, not just in the tech sector, then we have to apply that same thinking, which was that let's unlock the growth, let's give people the talented people who want to work in these sectors, let's give them the great places to do it, and then let's give them the freedom to actually come where they want to go and do the things they want to do on their terms, because actually we can only do so much for the private sector. We've got to give them the freedom. And I think hearing the stories about the private sector as a force for good, not just about coming in where there's an obvious opportunity or a low risk margin thing they can do, actually is the signal maybe to our public sector partners, like Bradford, like Leeds have done, that they all need to take that same attitude, because we have to be able to show reliably when you turn up in some of these places that maybe haven't got the same experience the Leeds and Bradford have got, that haven't done the same journey, that they're going to get the same sort of treatment. Otherwise they'll be put off because it won't be a united offer. We've got to give people that coherent treatment so they feel like the North have all got this collective vision and are sharing it. And I think that's where things like the Convention of the North are really powerful, because we have got that in places you wouldn't necessarily imagine. Because if you're an energy company, you're not coming to Manchester, right? You're coming to Hull, you're going to Cumbria. And Hull and Cumbria have got to be just as mobilised as Manchester, because some of these opportunities outside of retail are in different places.
Tim, can I just bring you in on this idea of, we've talked about multi-use being the key, as you say, integrating with local communities. Things can take a long time though, can't they, in the retail landscape? But equally, things can change quickly in terms of what consumers want. So how flexible do you think, the retail setups are now that you're developing? Are they, because there is a chance technology could disrupt things sooner. Drones, maybe we're not that far off from travelling in them. Maybe, we're not that far off autonomous cars and things like that. So how flexible is what we're doing now?
Relatively inflexible, partly because of the banking system. So we as investors still have to get external finance to do our schemes. The external finance is against a valuation. The valuation methodology is against a 30, 40, 50-year-old system of calculating value. I mean, it's an absolute nonsense. So we're limited in terms of securing finance to do things more flexibly, because there's no long lease that you're going to get. You get flexible terms for your retail. But I mean, we've just in some of our schemes, we've actually funded smaller businesses set up. So we're creating effectively serviced retail. So we're enabling those smaller independents to actually have a physical presence in our schemes. And one that we've done up in Edinburgh as an example, they're doing about 9,000 a week in selling coffee. And we've got a small independent that's come in that was based out at Leith. We've created them a space right in the centre. We funded the fit out, so we effectively gave them a fully fitted retail unit. And we're looking at doing more and more of that, but that requires more capital investment, more equity investment, because the banks won't see that, and that is not necessarily valued until you've got that rolling 3, 4, 5-year history of performance. But that's the way we get that flexibility in.
So, Susan, is there a role then for local authorities in this, in terms of what they can provide for what the banks
absolutely.
don't?
So I spend all my time trying to push forward the economic growth of Bradford and West Yorkshire, in fact. And that, for me, that's about, as Henry says, creating the right environment. So focus on those transport arguments, speaking to government about what we need, drawing the investment down, think about where the next growth deal is going to come from. And education as well, making sure people have the skills, and therefore that will attract businesses. And also culture, as we talked about before. I think culture is really transformational for places. So with all those things, that's what we do as day in, day out, bread and butter. But of course, we're wanting to make sure that private sector investors feel enabled to do business in the city centre and in the districts at large. And that's why we've introduced the City Centre Growth Scheme. It's why local development orders we're bringing in to give that flexibility of use, with planning consent, and actually just making sure that we're a place to do business, and that we're approachable and people can come and talk to us, and we can see with the NEC example, for example, how we've actually used our prudential borrowing to make sure that gets off the ground. So we have to be innovative, we have to be entrepreneurial now as local authorities, and the ones who'll be most successful were the ones who are actually able to adapt quickest, even though, as you say, the marketplace is perhaps not as flexible as we'd like it to be.
Yeah, Angela, you were nodding. Do you want to add to that?
I think I mean, Tim made it's just the point earlier, which was about you with your businesses. It's about partnership, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the retail landscape has actually moved pretty quickly. I mean, if we think about a local example in Leeds when Land Securities were developing Trinity, and all of a sudden, you know, they were left with a unit that they had to refit, and inevitably brought forward Trinity Kitchen, which has been replicated up and down the country already. And then if you take that example and put it into Altrincham Market, which, you know, is a huge success story, but 5 or 6 years it wasn't. And what they actually did was not just invest in the space, they invested in the businesses as well, as simple as, you know, giving people loans for pizza ovens and having a payback method.
Yeah.
So the ability for local authorities to start investing in business, not just the physical asset class, is something I think we need to explore more and more.
Yeah. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question at this point? Anything that's now? Anything? Yes, we'll just get a microphone to you if that's all right, sir.
I think the last point you made was probably the most important point of the session, where it's very easy to invest in hard stuff, things that are easy to measure, whereas if culture truly is transformational, and we all know it is because we're people, it seems almost impossible to invest in culture, because culture itself is quite bitty and messy, and it's almost a thing that comes for free. So how you fund and how you work with people who are the cultural fabric, you know, the artists, the makers, all these people. I hear it time and time again. Is during a scheme, during a development, everyone talks about culture, but it's never where the money goes often, or it's very difficult to get money into those areas. And I don't really have a question, I suppose. It's probably how do you do that?
It's a point we can discuss, though, because I'm sure you probably disagree. I imagine you think you.
So in Bradford, we've increased our number of NPOs, National Portfolio Organisations, this year, and we had a 65% uplift in the funding going to those organisations. And that wasn't about our money as a local authority, but us working with Arts Council to say, look, what you've got here is a rich fabric of culture. If you're really interested in investing in youth, because we're the youngest city in the UK, in diversity, you need to be investing in Bradford. So we're working alongside them to help them get that funding in. I think what we're also doing is, rather than investing in our own events, we're saying, giving that money to the cultural sector in Bradford and saying, what can you do with this, rather than buying in events and from elsewhere and letting them just happen in the city centre. So we're trying to use the limited resources we've got to pump that sector as much as it can and support it to get those funds in from Arts Council and elsewhere to make sure they thrive, because absolutely that fabric of cultural organisations is what is going to actually be the bedrock of cultural regeneration. We cannot do culture to people as a council. That's not what we are. So we have to support the organisations that do, and that's how we're doing it.
I'd sell one of the assets that Leeds have got, which is East Street Arts, which is another one of those national portfolio organisations who don't want to take public money anymore. They want to stop taking it and leave it for other people to have, and want to commercialise their model, including by taking a role in developments and thinking proactively about how they can play a part in creating opportunities to make other people's schemes more attractive across a range of sectors, actually, to make cities more vibrant places to live, and see themselves as a role for essentially a voluntary sector arts organisation in doing proactive development with partners. So I think that the role of the culture and creative sector is changing. So people who've got their own art hotel, right, and who understand what a loan is and understand how to buy property, relatively small scale, can then start to imagine, well, if I had a partner who needed to do another redevelopment and they had a bit of a scheme I could do for them, and I could make that wash its face, and it made the whole development more attractive, then that's a partnership that could work. And I think that's the type of collaboration that we're starting to see across the north, which is that creative and cultural organisations don't see themselves as kind of beneficiaries of public money, but as actors for change, economic and social, in their communities. And I think that we came back to sort of that Bolton example, that reality is this is being made to work. And actually, if you want to create artistic space in cities, for goodness sakes, don't just fund an art project. Think about all the other things you're doing in a city or a town and use that. And I think that that's the way in which, as well, those sorts of creative approaches can also, in blunt terms, contribute to the overall financial case for doing something.
Yeah.
They're not standalone.
Angela, you were going to...
I think member of the audience made a really good point, is a lot of people see culture as being free, and
Yeah.
it's not. It's a business in its own right, you know, and artists are businesses in their own right. And I think what's been transformational for us as a city region is that we now have a LEP member, Nicola Greenan from East Street Arts, who champions culture and really calls us out in saying, well, it's not free, it's part of our business, and what are we doing as a city and a city region to support it? And I know when our leader, Councillor Judith Blake, came in to be the leader, she firmly took the economy portfolio and the culture portfolio and put them together so that it was integrated as an economic output, because it is that important.
Yeah, and I think it comes back, Tim, to what you were saying right at the beginning, which is by including the community in all of this, it's not you telling them we're putting culture in, it's you, that they are essentially creating it because you're facilitating it.
Yeah, it's getting a blend. So you've got to have your core retail, you've got to have your core food, you've got to have your leisure these days, and then there's all the other bits and pieces that you can add in, which is your independent retail and your culture. The problem for us as private organisations is, you know, culture is a real challenge to make it financially viable. It's effectively a giveaway. So what we're doing, using Bolton again as an example, we've got the theatre in there. So they've actually taken a unit within the shopping centre and they've created a temporary theatre. And we're looking at rolling that out because it's just another reason to come to the scheme. It's another community contribution. So we've got to get footfall and we've got to get dwell times in our schemes. And actually by creating these giveaways, yeah, there's a financial hit, but what it does do, it maintains the performance of the shopping centre as a whole.
Yeah, so just to wrap things up, because I'm aware we've got a couple of minutes left, can you just give us, coming back to the kind of the theme of all this, the Northern Powerhouse, what to you then is the Northern Powerhouse going to be in another 5 years' time, Susan? What would you say is how it will be seen?
I'd say I'd like us to have a more confident brand for all Northern leaders, but also Northern people to feel ownership of it and not to denigrate it. It needs to be something to be proud of. And yes, we as leaders need to make sure that there are physical manifestations of it delivered in communities close to where people are so they can see what it means. So start to show the delivery, but also build the confidence of people that they are from the north and actually there's huge opportunities here because there are.
Yeah, Angela?
To actually be recognised as the 9th biggest economy in Europe without having to give everybody the stats underneath it, so it is that recognition.
Yeah, it's a bit like when it's the Olympics and we always say Yorkshire, if they were a country, would have been this.
Different debate.
Yeah, different debate. Go on, Henry.
I think to be in a place where we'd started on that journey to being as prosperous as the South and to give those opportunities, particularly to our children and young people, to achieve their own ambitions, because I think we've got huge potential here in the North, but the first step we need to do is give people, I think as Susan says, the confidence to believe that in their own lives we can transform their futures, not just the economy's future, but their future as individuals as well.
Yeah, the empowerment then. And Tim, final word with you.
I'd like it to be perceived as being a true global alternative for major international businesses, which I genuinely believe it is.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you ever so much. Can you put your hands together for our panellists?